like to review the weekly study questions just to give you a sense of what the idea behind each question was and give you an idea of what I was imagining in terms of correct answers. This week, the study questions are pretty light and pretty open-ended, so I won't spend too much time. In later weeks, they'll be more detailed. But I just want to give you a sense of what I was getting at. Number one, do you think that the engineers in either of the BER cases for this week actually did anything wrong? Why or why not? Of course, that is a matter of opinion, but it's a matter of informed opinion. That is, we have to think about what the facts of the case actually were, and then we have to think about on what basis we would determine that the engineer had actually done something unethical. And I think that one of the things you want to keep in mind when you read these BER cases especially is that if there is a claim on the part of the BER or a conclusion on the part of the board that the engineer did in fact do something wrong, then they should be able to point to some part of the code that's actually been violated. Their job really is to evaluate these cases in terms of the code, and if there is a claim or a conclusion that the engineer did act unethically, they should be able to point to a specific part of the code. So any answer there that they did do something wrong, or either of them did, would have to be backed up by some reference to the code and some argument that a part of the code had actually been violated by the engineer. Of course, that makes the case of the young engineer who takes the trip problematic because, it's questionable whether that person is actually a practicing engineer. I mean, we know that they've had an engineering education, they've graduated. We don't know if they've ever worked as an engineer. Arguably, the code applies to them just because they are identifying themselves as an engineer in terms of applying for work. So one could have a strong argument, I suppose, that the code actually does apply to them, even though they are not engaged in any sort of engineering work. But that's a question. It's a definite question. Certainly, if my memory serves me, the board did point to parts of the code. And I suppose that acting, those sort of broad principles of acting with integrity and avoiding deceptive acts and things like that would be the parts of the code that would actually be the ones that apply, and arguably the ones that the engineer violated. I think that with the case of the practicing engineer who didn't return messages for a long period of time, it's probably easier to make a case in terms of specific parts of the code being violated, that they actually did something unethical. And that largely, I think, is a fourth canon. That is, there's no question that engineer is in a professional relationship with the other party as a client, if I'm not mistaken. And that what goes along with that are certain duties, broadly speaking, to act as a faithful agent and trustee of the client. And that notion of acting as an agent is a broad and I would say meaningful idea, in the sense that if you're acting as someone's agent, you are acting in their interests, and you have committed yourself to acting on their behalf. And so that if you ignore their messages, it's a pretty strong case that you're ignoring that obligation. Number two, do you think the issues involved in these two cases are important enough to justify the BER spending its time on them? Why or why not? Of course, that is a very open question. That's not a question that directly involves any specific part of the code or application of the code. It's really a judgment call. I have made the case, or I have suggested over and over again, I think, about these cases, that I like them because they're not all that important. But on the other hand, they point towards issues that are very interesting and important in the sense that they highlight the differences between acting as a professional in the sense of being a member of a profession and acting in another sort of job. I think especially the case of the unanswered messages, that if we were talking about a person involved in a business that clearly was not a profession, we could be talking about the prudential aspects of what the person did in terms of not returning messages. When I say prudential, I mean practical. I mean, it's just not wise if you're involved in a business enterprise to ignore any sort of business associate for long periods of time. It's not going to be good for the conduct of your business. Treating other people like that, ignoring them, is just impractical in the sense that it's not going to help you in business. But that's not what's at issue here. What's at issue here is the idea that the engineer here had an obligation, which was not a prudential thing. It was not a practical thing. It was not about what you should do if you want to succeed practically in engineering. It was about what ethical duties you have to a client, irrespective of those prudential considerations. I think that probably the same goes for the other case too, in the sense that okay, if the person involved was not an engineer, was somebody involved in something which is clearly not a profession, one might say that what they did was somewhat deceptive and therefore wrong, but it has an entirely different, I would say, an entirely different value when it's done by a professional or somebody who's entering into the profession. So I think that on the one hand, it could be argued that, especially the case of the taking of the trip, is just too small a matter to. I can entirely see an argument. It's too small a matter. It's not that important. There are other things having to do with engineering which are much more important than this. And I can see too the not returning messages as being perhaps not that important either. But that would mean you need to make an argument to that effect, which I think is, you can make a good argument to that effect. And I think you could also make a good argument to the effect that because of the special relationship that a professional has with their client, that these seemingly trivial matters take on a whole different value.